Hello, friends. My name is Labifia Shremadako. And the last time we were together, we had a presentation from Stefan Gustavsson on sexuality, a really insightful presentation that promises to give you so much to reflect on the subject of sexuality. And today we'll just have a conversation around the presentation we had the other time. If you haven't had the opportunity to take a look at it, we encourage you to do so. And for those of you who had the opportunity to take a look at it, you realize that it gave us a lot of perspective from the West. And so today we are being joined by two friends from ICAS here in Ghana, who would also bring on board the African perspective to the subject. And we're still joined by Stefan to help us carry on the conversation. And so we're really glad to have you join us.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for making the time. You're welcome back. I'll just do a quick round of introductions of who is in the room with us today. With me here, I have Anani. Anani, I'll just give you a minute to tell us about yourself. A minute.
Yeah, my name is Kwabna Anania Jikun. I'm a member of the Institute for Christian Apologetic Studies, and I'm here today to join in the conversation that Stefan began on sexuality. We're just going to share our thoughts and see how the Lord will lead us in understanding this phenomenon and how we can respond adequately to it as Christians and as Christians in Africa and in Ghana. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anani. Joining us online is Desmond. Desmond, can you take a minute to introduce yourself to us as well?
Thank you, Love. I am Desmond Atukumsin, also a member of ICAS, Institute of Christian Apologetic Studies. So it's a pleasure to be with you all, to have this wonderful discussion about sexuality and the Christian view on it, especially in Ghana here and also in Africa. It was so great hearing from Stefan how the evolution of sexuality in the West, and we hope to have a wonderful discussion.
Thank you, Desmond. Stefan, thank you for joining us again. Stefan introduced himself at length in the first conversation. And so if you didn't have the opportunity, just like I said earlier, please make time to take a look at that. And then you can situate this conversation also right with that knowledge. Thank you very much. And so just like I said earlier also, the last presentation focused heavily on the Western perspective, the journeys, all the revolutions that we have seen and where we are today. And so I'll start with you, Desmond, thinking about the subject of sexuality in the African context. What are your reflections?
Thank you, Love. Yeah, I think it's a very important point that we need to look at, especially in our contemporary culture here. We've seen a new wave of sexuality, even in the African context, and even especially here in Ghana as well. And we've seen laws being enacted by various countries in Africa as well concerning this issue. And in Ghana particularly, we have Christians, predominantly Christians, and there are a lot of arguments going on concerning this issue. Culturally speaking, we see traditionally how we are growing up in Ghana. There's always been a man getting married to a woman, and we've seen people bringing in an argument of it's being an infusion of the Western culture upon we, the Africans, and talking about a pre-colonial way of life in Africa where we embrace every kind of sexuality, especially homosexuality, and that those practices were not looked down on or stigmatized or discriminated on. But the issue here, as Stefan addressed in his talk previously, will be, are we trying to validate a practice or an act by the practices of our ancestors. This is something that is generic, where we see even the Greeks practicing it in the times of Paul, the ancient Greeks and everything practicing it as well. So even if it's a pre-colonial practice here in Africa, that should be a standard to validate the act itself? What should be the argument for the validation of homosexuality in Africa? The fact that we have kings in Africa practicing it doesn't mean that it was culturally accepted at that time. The fact we have individuals practicing doesn't mean that it was culturally accepted in that context at that time. So we should look at the religious background of those places as well. We should look at how Christianity came into Africa. And most of the time, I hear this argument that it was brought in by the European missionaries, but which also is not the case as well. So there's a religious context to which African culture has been developed, and all over generations, it has been an affirmation of a man and a woman being brought together in marriage, without we looking at the extremes of it. So when people talk about practices invalidating the act, then we need to be really careful about that. We should look at the subject at hand in terms of their validation based on the morality which the African culture was ascribing to at that time, not just by the practices of some few individuals in that culture. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Desmond. I'll turn this over to you, Anani. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So I hear the complaint that we are losing our values as Africans as a result of Westernization.
Mm-hmm.
In reflecting a little bit further, in my opinion, I think that it's not the Westernization of a culture that makes us lose our values and the things we hold dear, but rather I think it is secularization, rather, not just Westernization. If there is anything of the West that comes into, it may be the appreciation or their embracing of secularization in their context that is now coming here. But it is not just the mere Westernization of a culture that makes that culture loses its value. I think it is the secularization of a culture that makes that culture move away, especially if it was a theistic culture where they believed in the supernatural or they believed in a supernatural creator. Then secularization is the process by which God as that creator and anything that is affiliated to him, institutions, ideas, begin to lose its social significance. And I think that with that comes certain other things. And so first and foremost, I think that is what I can say, that I think that there is a gradual secularization of the African, and therefore we are embracing certain things that were the same effect of secularization in the West. And so for me, those are some of the things I'm looking at. Also, you realize that with secularization coming in, probably within the cloak of Western philosophy, current Western philosophy, let me put it that way, then you realize that those Africans and African leaders who may be strong in our traditions would now begin to tighten their laws to make it even more undesirable to go that path. And then you would have nations who want to be seen as progressive, moving forward, in quotes, open-minded, struggling to either accept such thinking and such lifestyles. And unfortunately, again, these are my thoughts, unfortunately, without understanding the processes that led to other people embracing those lifestyles, we now just take it wholesale, and then we somehow embrace it and say that as a reflection of our openness, as a reflection of our modernity, as a reflection of our progressiveness,
Mhm.
we also now are embracing the lifestyles that are associated with being a progressive state. So I think that the reality is there. It is a real thing, primarily within young adults now, who are exposed to other cultures, who are reading, who are watching. And because of technology, we're able to see things and ideas going in other cultures. And so it's something that is really real and pertinent, that as Africans, we can't close our eyes. And as African Christians, we cannot close our eyes and fold our arms and not give a response to it.
Okay, sure. Thank you very much, Anani. In the early stages of the presentation Stefan gave the last time, something that he mentioned that really stuck with me was that the dialogue that we have as a church with these communities should reflect truth and grace. So I just want to hear from you. Also, Stefan, I'll throw this to you first. How, based on what you've heard from Anani and then Desmond about the African context and how things are going currently in our context, how do we as African Christians tell truth or dialogue with the power holders in the culture, and also even individuals within the culture that have been exposed to, just as Anani describes, this secularization that comes shrouded in westernization? How do we approach these conversations with truth and grace?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for the two comments here. Very, very insightful. If I just start with a reflection on what have been said here, and then I will move into the question of how we communicate truth and grace. It's interesting, I think, that some issues are common in all cultures in terms of sexuality and problems related to sexuality. So, for example, the general problem of promiscuity, and especially of men seeking non-committed sexual encounters, is there in all cultures. And you can see men with power and authority are taking advantage of servants, or before that of slaves, and so on. So you find that in all cultures, the temptation to live a promiscuous life. And you can see there are brothels, prostitutes in all cultures where men, again, because we are often the problem in terms of sexuality, men are buying sexual services, and that goes for all cultures in the world. So some issues are kind of transcultural. They are there all the time, and a culture needs to wrestle with them. And then there are some other issues that can be more specific to a culture. Now, I have visited Ghana once, but just for a short time. I know too little about the situation in Ghana, but I know that in a number of African contexts, polygamy is an issue. Is marriage between one man and one woman, or is polygamy an option? Is that affirmed? In other cultures, like in the Western culture, that has not been an issue for many, many centuries. So we don't have that issue. So one needs to work also with one's own culture, like Desmond talked about the history of Ghana, and what are our specific challenges. So there will be some challenges that are kind of universal, and then in a culture there can be some specific issues which we need to wrestle with. I totally agree that we need to, when we wrestle with issues of sexuality, we need to connect them to the bigger picture and the whole question of a worldview. And as I said, the new view of homosexuality in the West is connected to the sexual revolution, which goes back to the Enlightenment and the dethronement of God. The secularization, you can say, that we don't submit any longer to a higher authority above us. We ourselves are the authority. We become autonomous. So I think it's really important to see this connection with secularization. And for Christian leaders in Africa, where you for a long time have had much more of a traditional religious worldview, where the big issue has not been, is there a God or a supernatural reality or not? I think it's a key question because of the influence in the young generation from media and the academia to see the whole issue of secularization, which hits the young generation. And if you become secular, your whole understanding of the human being and of sexuality will change. So one really needs to address that. I'm grateful that you brought that up, because I think it's a key question. So when we are talking then about sexuality, I think I'm looking at different Christian contexts here in Sweden, and I think like this: when we want to address an ethical issue, a question of what is right, what is wrong, immediately when we're confronted with an ethical issue, there will be a kind of distance between the ideal and the practical reality of our lives. Just to make an illustration. So should we lie? No, the ideal is to be truthful. We should not lie. Nearly everyone accepts that ideal. This is the way it should be. We should be truthful. We should never lie. What is the practical reality? Well, everyone has lied. So there is always this distance between the ideal, the ethical ideal, and the practical reality. So what do we do then when we realize here is this distance? Now, looking at churches in the West, thinking about sexuality, a number of churches then they do this. Let's lower the ideal. They're lowering the ethical bar so it matches the way we live. So they become liberal, and they start to change their sexual ethic. Other churches that see this, they think, no, we cannot lowering the ethical bar. And then they become hypocrites, pretending that everyone is living according to the ethical standard. And the key thing is not to be exposed, because if you're exposed, then you are condemned and you're thrown out of the fellowship. So you become a very harsh community. Now, that is not a beautiful picture. So I don't like that either. I think the solution of this discrepancy between the ideal and the reality, the solution is the gospel solution, which has two parts. Firstly, the grace of God, forgiveness through the blood of Christ that cleanses us from our sin, from our history, from our failures. And secondly, the power of God, the Holy Spirit, that can renew our lives and help us to start to live in a way that reflects the ideal. So we need to be really gospel-centered people, which proclaims the grace of God and proclaims the power of God to live a new life. So we shouldn't lower the ethical standard. We shouldn't pretend something that is not true, that we all have lived according to the standard, but we should be honest people. And when we start with grace, God's grace and God's power, I think it's possible to communicate to people. So that would be my basic perspective on
yes.
that.
Thank you very much for that, Stefan. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that with us. Definitely to extend grace that has been extended to us through Christ Jesus. Desmond, I wanted to throw this back to you, if you have any thoughts on what Stefan just shared.
Yes, thank you so much, Stefan, for this enlightening statements. And I think I'll just add a little statements to it. I think, first of all, it becomes very difficult if the church, the way the church behaves towards people who ascribe to these behaviors or who are into the circumstances or situation. The personal interaction between the church and the such individuals is normally estranged, and we need to look at it critically as Christians. Sometimes the cultural dynamics between the church, especially the leaders of the church, and also the members of the church, makes it difficult for them to approach their leaders to discuss these problems, especially here in Africa and here in Ghana as well. It's sometimes difficult to open up and not just to talk about all the sexuality, but even any forms of flaws and sins that we encounter. We find it difficult to approach our leaders to talk about it. And I think it's high time the church look at this matter critically in love. In Stefan's previous talk, he made mention of this stereo perspective where we look at homosexuality as itself as an act, then the homosexual, the person itself, and the culture itself. So in as much as the church has a response to the act of homosexuality, we should know how we love people who are into this thing, and know how we also respond to such a culture in our time as well. And this should be done not in the way of it being very harsh, or because when you look at movies and stuff, they are promoting this sexual agenda in a way that it comes so appealing to the younger generation. The phrases they use, and if Stefan has time, I think I would love if he can touch on that. It's totally different how the church responds to this. They have certain phrases that they use to appeal the generation, the young generation. They have certain words that they use, certain connotations, certain kind of things that they say. They're not trying to make a whole argument out of it, but the way it makes it more appealing to the younger generation has made most of them leave the church through this kind of, we need to have a way to respond to this. The person will not feel afraid to approach a leader of the church concerning the CPM issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Desmond.
Thank you, Desmond. Yes, Stefan, please go ahead.
Yes, I think you raise here a very important question, and that here has to do with the mentality or the attitude within the church. I'm so glad to hear that you have an apologetic institute in Ghana, because the whole mentality of apologetics is to invite people to pursue truth, to ponder, to ask questions, to investigate, to evaluate arguments, to compare different perspectives. And in many more traditional church settings, it has been like that here in Sweden too. You have the pastor, the Christian leaders, and they just proclaim a truth, and people listening are supposed to accept and obey without asking questions. And questions are viewed as criticism or as doubt or as something very unspiritual. And I think we need to consciously break that pattern. We need to create a context where there is openness to ask questions and to be respected, regardless of what kind of question. And it's, of course, especially sensitive in terms of sexuality, which is a touchy subject. But Christian leaders need to be challenged to deal with them in a respectful way. Too many Christian leaders and pastors have not thought through those issues themselves, so they are a little bit insecure. And then that means that we often raises our voice. You know, there's this story about the preacher who have his notes, and then in a margin he writes, "Weak argument, raise the voice." And that is so often what we do. We speak with a louder voice when we lack an argument. But that is the absolute wrong way to go, especially when we think of young people who hang out on the internet and are influenced by, I guess also in Africa, with a lot of American entertainment, at least for in Europe. It's so much of the American entertainment. And through that, both films, videos, and music, it is communicated a sexual revolution. And it's portrayed as something very attractive, as you said, which is alluring, which is exciting, which is freedom and happiness and so on. And young people are looking at that. And it's not enough to just say, no, that's wrong. that will not help young people. So we need to walk alongside young people to help them reflect over what is sexuality, what is it to be a human being, and start to evaluate. And you can give many examples of how the sexual revolution has not created a sexually very happy culture, but there's so much pain connected with sexuality in the Western world today because we hurt each other by the way we live sexually. So we need much more of an apologetic culture within the churches, and with that I mean a culture, an attitude of openness to discuss. If Christianity is true, we do not need to be afraid for that kind of discussions. And it is truth that will make us free.
Thank you very much for speaking into that, Stefan. I'll come to you, Anani, for your thoughts as well. And when Anani is done, I'll come to each one of you for your final thoughts, and we can wrap up with the discussion. Thank you so much. So, Anani.
Right. Thank you again, Stefan. It's been quite insightful listening in. Some few thoughts here. Most often when I think of the trans agenda, I begin to ask myself so many things. When you engage and you bring up the matter of God as a reason not to, you are clearly shut down, because the understanding is that there is no God. It's more of an atheistic, naturalistic worldview that governs them in terms of their morality. But then I sit back and I ask myself, when you read a little bit about some of the assertions people like Richard Dawkins has made, this is what Richard says: DNA neither cares nor knows. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Meaning that at the end of the day, we are determined fully. So if the trans person subscribes to an atheistic, naturalistic worldview for which God is not present, then the question is, how are you transcending your biology? Because now you must be fully determined by your genes. There is nothing supernatural, transcendental beyond your biology. And from what we know, your chromosomes determines your gender, and then in terms of your gender identity. So now the question is, how are you transcending your biology when your entire worldview doesn't give you that right to be able to do that? So then those are some of the questions I ask myself, because if you subscribe to a theistic worldview, then we would now come in, as Stefan said, that if God is, then when we come to him, there must be that surrender to him, because if God is, then he is the creator, then naturally we are the created, and therefore we cannot supersede the creator in knowledge. So we must give ourselves to the creator to determine what he created and why he created. But if you throw away the creator and you believe that there isn't any creator, then your worldview must be able to defend or explain
what you are feeling, what you are doing. But naturalistic worldview, atheistic worldview doesn't grant you to transcend your biology. So you must now borrow from the theistic worldview to be able to give meaning to what you are even feeling deep within you. But the theistic worldview is what you are trying to throw out. And so you realize that there is no footing for an explanation of what you are even, what you are even feeling. And for me, that is one of the things that I reflect on when I think about the trans agenda. Again, just like in any other thing and in every other demand for rights, essential rights, as it were, to be treated as a human being, to be respected, to be regarded, and not to be violated, I keep on asking myself, where do we anchor those rights? How did you even come about the desire for rights? Why should I even give you any essential rights? If in the end, we came from an evolutionary process and we don't have a conferred essential worth from the one who created us. The whole thing I'm just trying to say is that the conversation of God cannot be excluded, because if we exclude God, the very reality or the very experience in itself we don't find categories to be able to explain or anchor those experiences. But now, if we have to now grant the existence of God, then we must now grant, how do we gain to know? Is he a deistic God who created and has left us to determine what we have to do? Or is he a God who is involved in that which he has created? What is it that he has said about the human being? How did he distinguish? How did he create? For what purpose did he create? Those are now the questions we have to ask when we grant the existence of God. And so for me, for the trans movement especially, it's an experience that people feel, and I will never dismiss that. But when we are having a conversation, we have to be able to grant the person of God. Other than that, their very experience in itself is not able to be anchored in any worldview, apart from the theistic worldview. So those are my comments on that.
Okay, thank you very much, Anani, for those very insightful reflections. Those are really deep thoughts. And we hope that and for you, those that are watching and listening, I hope that you continue to reflect on these things as well, because then it helps us to be able to ground our faith and to be able to have an answer when people ask us for the hope that is in us. So thank you very much. So I'll start with you, Desmond, then to Stefan, and finally to you, Anani, to take your final thoughts as we bring this session to a close. So Desmond, over to you.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Love. I think just some few thoughts, reflecting on what Stefan said last time in his talk. One, just some key points I took from it as well. The whole sexuality thing is not about human right or dignity, but it's more about ethics as well. And the incoherent argument that is being seen in the LGBTQ thing is something that I think most young people have not come to realize, and I think we need to talk more about it. Where people, because it has been put in the basket for everyone to take in without breaking it down, and listening to Stefan concerning how one aspect of it contradicts the other in terms of fixed identity and non-fixed identity. As we can see it, we realize that most of the young generations who ascribe to that don't really understand this, and they don't know much about this. So I think it would be helpful if we continue to let them know about this incoherent arguments that we see in this agenda as well. And finally, again, the approach of the church concerning this whole issue. We should have a response as a church, especially here in Ghana. The way that we respond sometimes seems to be more of a harsh attitude, and a blunt attitude concerning it, without love for such individuals. We need to be gracious enough, in as much as we reject the acts, but also we should also know that we are all fallen creatures in the eyes of God, and God reached out to us in love, with his loving arms, to call us from our fallen self into his wonderful presence, as Peter will put it. We were called from darkness into his wonderful light. And so we should also have this loving arm in reaching out to these ones as well, without being harsh. We should be able to separate the acts from the person as well, and help them be open enough to be approachable when a time is called for us to be approachable as well. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Desmond. Now to you, Stefan, what are your final thoughts?
Let me first say thank you for letting me be part of this dialogue. I appreciate that very much. I also appreciate very much the argument around the trans movement. I totally agree with your analysis there. It can be interesting to know that in Sweden, for a number of years, the trans movement have been very successful and strong, but during the last 1 or 2 years, it has actually come to a stop, and there's been quite a lot of secular criticism against the trans ideology, because it's been shown that so many of the young people who experience gender dysphoria, think they are born in the wrong body, they actually have different psychiatric diagnoses like autism. A huge percentage are actually struggling with other problems in their lives. And what has happened is that our culture have provided a new tool for those kids that have a psychiatric and psychological challenge within them. We have given them a new tool and said, maybe your struggle is because you are born in the wrong body. And it's a very high percent of young females with a diagnosis of autism that also are experience gender dysphoria. So it can be important to know that there seems to be some also secular criticism towards the trans movement. And in my presentation, of course, I focused almost exclusively on the same sex, the issue of homosexuality. But this is also a very important issue to deal with. And as we have said, both from the perspective of truth, but also from in perspective of love and grace towards people who are struggling with this and whose emotions in these areas are deep and real. So no one should question the experience itself. My final thought here is I have already referred to Jesus' word in John's Gospel, chapter 8. In our culture, the kind of credo, the kind of confession is freedom will make me true by being free from all restrictions, from all definitions from the outside, from all authorities above me. If I'm breaking loose from all those restrictions, then I can find my true self, then I will be true. So freedom will make me into the true me, the true humanity. Jesus reverses that and says that truth will set you free. Truth about who God is, truth about who I am, created in his image, fallen into sin, but also offered redemption and new creation through the gospel of Jesus Christ. The truth about me, the truth about sexuality. So it's truth that long-term will set me free. And here you have the contrast. Our culture says freedom will make me true, and the gospel says no, it's truth that will set you free.
Amen. Thank you very much for that, Stefan. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you join us for this dialogue. Anani, finally to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Stefan. Just the last statement that it is freedom will make us true. I think I would probably ask if the person, one, are you free from every restrictions? No. Is that statement true? If you tell me that statement is true, then it means that you are able to determine the truthfulness of the statements while still having some restrictions. And therefore, you don't need all your freedoms to be able to determine what is true. But that's just by the way. I think for me, I anchor the question of sexuality in the question of origin. Did we evolve from an evolutionary process, a moral process? Then we can determine who we are. If we were created by a being, then it is wise to find out what the purpose for which we were created for. And so for me, the question of origin is very paramount in this. And if you borrow and you subscribe to an atheistic worldview, then the other questions of human rights and every other thing, racism, they don't have any place to stand, because it's just your opinion on the matter and not something transcendentally right or wrong. You realize that you are borrowing from something that you do not want to. And that is where I think, for me, I would anchor some of these things. But the problem is growing, or if I should say, the condition is growing in our setting here in Ghana and in Africa. We are having a lot of political pressure to embrace it without thoughts, without discussion, without engaging. And if you are somebody who legitimately is having this, not because it benefits you financially or it's a social status you want to have, but you are deeply struggling with this, we hear you, we see you, it is a real thing. But what Stefan said was, one, our identity is not, the sum of identity is not in our sexuality. And we saw the one who lived the most fulfilling life live without expressing any form of sexuality, neither heterosexual, nor homosexual, nor any other sexuality. And this tells us that the meaning of life by far is not in our sexual identity, not in any other, but in our relationship to God. And I think that if you can look at the person of Jesus Christ and seek his wisdom and help, there's a possibility you may find strength to be able to address the inner disposition that you may be having and live a more meaningful life than just expressing whatever you may be feeling within you. I end with this story from one man called Henry Nouwen. Christian, he was a Dutch priest. And it is recorded that Henry Nouwen dispositionally was a homosexual. But for the very sake of Christ, he never expressed that. And God gives grace not just to homosexuality or any other sexual orientation apart from what we believe to be what God has ordained, that for any other sin that is in our lives or any other moral issue that we may be facing, Christ gives strength and gives us the desire not to even want to express those things. And so we invite people to try Christ out. We invite people to seek help from the person of Jesus Christ. And it seems as if primarily in the Western media, they are being shut down to even recommend any other possible help apart from the person affirming
that which is very dangerous. But we are saying that do not close Christ out of the equation. Give room and see what he can do with even just a little faith if you would only ask him for help. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Once again, thank you, Anane. Thank you, Desmond. Thank you, Stefan. This has been a wonderful dialogue, and thank you for sharing all of those reflections. It's been just refreshing for me sitting and listening to all of these thoughts and reflections and how it points back to our Creator God. And for our friends who have joined us to listen in on this, I hope that this blesses you. And if you have any questions, if you would want to reach us, kindly send us a message, leave us a message on our social media platforms, send us a DM, and we will be happy to engage with you. Thank you very much for joining us. Until next time, thank you again. Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.